The blizzard had teeth, and Cole Weston felt every bite as he trudged through the white hell that had swallowed the Rocky Mountain backcountry. Behind him, hoofbeats struggled against the wind, a limping shadow that refused to abandon him. The wounded Mustang had been following for miles, its breath forming desperate clouds in the killing cold. Cole had named storms before, but this one felt personal, like God's own test written in ice and fury. When he turned to see the horse's eyes, dark and knowing, something cracked open in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Subscribe now. This broken ranger and wounded Mustang are about to discover why some meetings are written in heaven. The wind carved through Cole Weston's soul like a blade made of winter itself, each gust carrying the weight of every life he'd failed to save in these mountains. His ranger badge felt heavy beneath the layers of thermal gear, a cold metal reminder that being a guardian meant carrying ghosts. The storm had come down like God's own judgment, turning familiar trails into a maze of white death, and Cole knew these mountains well enough to taste their moods. This wasn't just weather, this was the kind of blizzard that swallowed men whole and spat out their bones come spring. His radio crackled with static and desperate voices from base camp, but the words dissolved into the howling void before they could reach his ears. The snow fell so thick it seemed to erase the world one flake at a time, leaving only Cole and the terrible certainty that someone out here needed him. Behind him the hoofbeats came again, uneven, struggling, but persistent as prayer. Cole had first noticed the Mustang 3 miles back, a dark shape moving through the white like a ghost with purpose. The horse was limping badly, favoring its left front leg, but it followed him with the determination of something that had nowhere else to go. Every time Cole stopped to check his bearings, the Mustang stopped too, standing in the swirling snow like a statue carved from suffering. Its coat was the color of old leather, scarred and weathered, with ice crystals forming in its mane like tiny prayers frozen in time. The animal's eyes held a depth that made Cole's chest tighten, the same look he'd seen in mirrors after too many failed rescues, too many families he'd had to face with empty hands. This horse knew loss, knew the weight of carrying on when everything inside screamed to lie down and let the cold take over. The Mustang's breath came in ragged clouds that the wind tore apart before they could rise, and Cole found himself matching his pace to the animal's labored rhythm. There was something biblical about the scene. Man and beast struggling through the wilderness, both wounded, both refusing to surrender. Cole's father had been a preacher before the bottle took him, and the old man's voice echoed in the wind now, speaking of shepherds and lost sheep, of how God sometimes sent the broken to save the broken. The ranger's hands were numb inside his gloves, but he could still feel the phantom weight of the rope that had snapped 6 months ago, the one that should have saved the climber who fell into the canyon. That failure lived in his bones now, a cold that no amount of thermal gear could touch. The Mustang stumbled, caught itself, and kept coming, and Cole wondered if animals could carry guilt the way humans did. The trail ahead disappeared into a wall of white that seemed to mock every landmark Cole had memorized over 15 years of mountain rescue. His GPS flickered between signal and static, the screen fogging with each breath as he tried to read their position. The cold was becoming personal now, seeping through every layer of protection to find the places where doubt lived. Cole's radio squawked again. Something about a missing hiker, a teenage girl who'd been separated from her group near Devil's Canyon, but the transmission cut out before he could respond. The Mustang whinnied softly, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like a knife through silk, and when Cole turned, the horse was looking off to the left, toward a section of forest that wasn't on any marked trail. Its ears were pricked forward, alert despite the exhaustion that hung on its frame like a shroud. Cole felt the familiar tug of instinct, the same feeling that had guided him to 3 successful rescues and 1 devastating failure. The horse was trying to tell him something, its body language speaking a language older than words. The animal's nostrils flared as it tested the air, and there was recognition in its posture, not just awareness but memory. Cole's training told him to stick to the marked trails, to follow protocol and wait for backup, but his heart was listening to something deeper. The Mustang took a tentative step toward the unmarked path, then looked back at Cole with eyes that held the weight of unspoken knowledge. The wind howled between them, like the voice of every soul lost in these mountains, and Cole felt the moment stretch like a prayer waiting for an answer. The horse knew something he didn't, and in that knowing, Cole glimpsed the terrible possibility that this broken animal might be his salvation. The decision came without thought, the way all the important ones did. Cole adjusted his pack and followed the Mustang into the unmarked wilderness, leaving the safety of the trail behind. The horse moved with renewed purpose despite its injury, picking its way through the snow-laden pines with the careful precision of something following a scent trail invisible to human senses. Each step took them deeper into the storm's heart, where the wind spoke in tongues, and the cold had teeth sharp enough to strip flesh from bone. Cole's breath came harder now, not from exertion but from the growing certainty that this moment had been written long before either of them had entered these mountains. The Mustang's hoofprints filled with snow almost as soon as they were made, erasing their passage like God covering their tracks. Behind them, the marked trail disappeared into memory, and ahead lay only the white unknown and the terrible hope that sometimes the broken could still save the lost. The Mustang moved through the storm like it was following a map written in its very bones, each labored step carrying the weight of purpose that transcended the physical pain radiating from its injured leg. Cole watched the animal's nostrils flare with each breath, testing the air for something his human senses couldn't detect, and he found himself trusting this wounded creature more than his own 15 years of mountain experience. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, filtering the storm's chaos for sounds that mattered, and there was an urgency in its movement that spoke of time running out. Snow clung to its mane like tiny prayers frozen in time, and each exhale created clouds that the wind immediately devoured, as if the storm was hungry for every sign of life. The path they followed existed only in the Mustang's memory, winding between trees that stood like silent sentinels in the white cathedral of the forest. Cole's radio remained silent now, the static having given way to the kind of dead air that meant they were truly alone with whatever fate awaited them in the wilderness. The cold had moved beyond discomfort into the realm of spiritual testing, each breath burning Cole's lungs like ice-cold fire, while his extremities began the slow retreat toward numbness. His face mask was crusted with ice from his own breathing, and the world had narrowed to the immediate circle of visibility around the Mustang's dark form. The horse paused frequently, not from exhaustion, but from some internal compass that required recalibration, its head lifting to test the wind before choosing the next direction. There was something almost mystical about watching the animal work, the way it seemed to commune with forces beyond the physical realm, and Cole found himself remembering his grandmother's stories about horses that could find their way home across impossible distances. The Mustang's injury was clearly painful. Cole could see the way it favored the damaged leg, the slight hitch in its gait that spoke of torn muscle or strained tendon, but the animal pressed forward with the determination of something answering a call that couldn't be ignored. The forest around them had taken on the quality of a fever dream, with snow-laden branches creating tunnels and archways that seemed to shift and change with each gust of wind. Cole's world had shrunk to the rhythm of the Mustang's breathing, the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the constant whisper of wind through pine needles that sounded almost like voices calling from the deep woods. His own breathing had synchronized with the horse's, creating a shared rhythm that felt like prayer, and he found himself thinking about the theological implications of following a wounded animal through a blizzard toward an unknown destination. The Mustang stopped suddenly, its head raised high, nostrils working overtime as it processed some scent that had caught its attention. The pause stretched long enough for Cole to feel his heart hammering against his ribs, And when the horse finally moved again, there was new urgency in its step, as if whatever it had been seeking was finally within reach. The terrain began to change subtly, the gentle slope they'd been following giving way to a series of small ridges and valleys that created natural windbreaks in the storm. Cole recognized this area now. They were approaching the network of seasonal shelters that the Park Service maintained for emergency use, though none should have been occupied during a storm of this magnitude. The Mustang's pace quickened despite its injury, and Cole could see steam rising from its coat as the animal's body heat fought against the killing cold. There was recognition in the horse's posture now, the way its ears pricked forward and its head turned toward a specific direction, and Cole felt his pulse quicken with the terrible possibility that they might actually find what they were looking for. The wind carried new sounds now, not just the endless howl of the storm, but something else, something that might have been human if he let himself believe it. The Mustang suddenly veered left, following what might have been a game trail, or might have been nothing more than a gap between trees, but the animal moved with such certainty that Cole didn't question the choice. The horse's breathing had become more labored, each exhale creating larger clouds of vapor that spoke of an animal pushing itself beyond its physical limits, and Cole found himself whispering encouragement that the wind immediately stole. The snow was deeper here, reaching almost to the Mustang's belly in places, but the animal plowed through with the determination of something that had found its true north. Cole's own legs were burning with the effort of following, his snowshoes sinking deep with each step, but he could feel something building in the air around them, a tension that spoke of approaching revelation. The Mustang's ears were locked forward now, focused on something ahead that Cole couldn't yet see, and the animal's entire body language spoke of a creature that had finally found what it had been seeking all along. When the Mustang finally stopped, it was so sudden that Cole nearly collided with the animal's hindquarters, and as he looked up to see what had captured the horse's attention, his breath caught in his throat like a prayer that had forgotten its words. Through the swirling snow, barely visible against the white backdrop of the storm, was the dark outline of a collapsed shelter. Its roof caved in under the weight of accumulated snow, and its walls partially buried in drifts that spoke of hours or perhaps days of accumulation. The Mustang stood perfectly still now, its head lowered toward the wreckage as if in mourning, and Cole could see that the animal was trembling, not from cold, but from some deeper emotion that transcended the physical realm. The horse had led him here with purpose, following a scent trail that spoke of memory and recognition, and as Cole stared at the collapsed structure, he felt the terrible certainty that whatever lay beneath that snow was the reason this wounded Mustang had refused to abandon him in the storm. Cole's hands moved without conscious thought, his training taking over as he approached the collapsed shelter with the careful precision of someone who had seen too many scenes like this one. The Mustang stood vigil beside him, its breath coming in steady clouds that seemed to mark time, like a metronome counting down to revelation. And the animal's eyes never left the buried structure. Snow had accumulated against the shelter's remains in drifts that spoke of hours of steady accumulation, and Cole could see where the roof had given way under the weight, creating a cavity that might, God willing, have provided some protection for anyone trapped inside. His shovel felt inadequate against the magnitude of snow that needed moving, but he began digging anyway, each scoop carrying the weight of hope and desperation in equal measure. The Mustang moved closer, its injured leg forgotten as it used its muzzle to push snow aside, and Cole found himself working in partnership with this wounded animal toward a goal that neither of them could fully articulate. The wind continued its relentless assault, immediately beginning to fill in the holes they created, but they pressed on with the determination of creatures who understood that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The first sign that their efforts weren't in vain came when Cole's shovel struck something that wasn't snow or wood, fabric, bright orange against the white, the kind of high-visibility material that marked emergency gear. His heart hammered against his ribs as he cleared more snow, revealing a section of sleeping bag that was still intact, still holding the shape of something human beneath its protective shell. The Mustang whinnied softly, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like recognition made audible, and Cole could see the animal's nostrils flaring as it caught a scent that meant something beyond his human understanding. Working faster now, Cole cleared away more snow, revealing the outline of a person curled in the fetal position, motionless, but still wrapped in the insulation that might have kept them alive through the worst of the storm. The sleeping bag was partially buried under a section of collapsed roof beam, but the angle of the debris had created a small air pocket, and Cole found himself praying to a god he'd been angry with for 6 months, that this pocket had been enough. When he finally cleared enough snow to see the person's face, Cole's breath caught in his throat like a sob that had forgotten how to escape. It was a girl, maybe 16 or 17, with dark hair that had escaped from her winter hat and skin that was pale, but not yet the waxy white of hypothermia's final stages. Her lips were blue, and her breathing was so shallow it was barely visible, but she was alive, unconscious but alive. And Cole felt something break open in his chest that had been frozen since his last failed rescue. The Mustang moved closer, its muzzle nearly touching the girl's exposed cheek, and the animal's breath created small clouds of warmth that seemed to caress her face like a blessing. There was recognition in the horse's posture, a familiarity that spoke of previous encounters, and Cole realized that this wounded animal had somehow remembered this girl's scent from some earlier meeting, had carried that memory through miles of blizzard to lead him to this exact spot. Cole's training kicked into overdrive as he assessed the girl's condition, checking for pulse and breathing while his mind raced through the protocols for severe hypothermia. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her breathing, though shallow, showed no signs of the irregular patterns that would indicate imminent organ failure. The sleeping bag had done its job, creating a micro-environment that had kept her core temperature from dropping to fatal levels. But she was still in critical condition and needed immediate medical attention. The Mustang stood guard over them both, its body positioned to block the worst of the wind, and Cole found himself working in the shelter of this wounded animal's protection. His radio crackled to life suddenly, a burst of static that resolved into a voice calling his designation, and Cole grabbed for it with hands that shook from more than just the cold. The transmission was broken and intermittent, but he managed to relay their approximate position and the nature of the emergency before the signal faded back into white noise. The girl stirred slightly as Cole worked to stabilize her, her eyelids fluttering without quite opening, and he found himself talking to her in the same gentle tone he might use with a frightened animal. The Mustang seemed to understand that its job was done but not finished, positioning itself to provide windbreak, while Cole prepared the girl for transport. Every movement had to be careful and deliberate. Hypothermia victims were fragile, their bodies balanced on the knife's edge between survival and system failure, and any sudden shock could tip them over into cardiac arrest. Cole's emergency bivvy sack crinkled as he unfolded it, the metallic material designed to reflect body heat back toward its occupant, and he worked with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before, but never under circumstances quite like these. The Mustang's presence was both comfort and mystery, this wounded animal that had somehow known exactly where to lead him. And as Cole looked into the horse's dark eyes, he saw something that looked remarkably like satisfaction, the expression of a creature that had fulfilled its purpose. The wind began to shift as Cole finished wrapping the girl in the emergency bivvy, and through the swirling snow, he could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors fighting against the storm. The Mustang's ears pricked forward at the sound, and the animal took a step back as if understanding that its part in this rescue was coming to an end. Cole found himself reaching out to touch the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of life beneath the ice-crusted coat, and in that moment of contact he felt something pass between them, an understanding that transcended species and spoke to the deeper connections that bind all living things. The girl's breathing seemed to strengthen slightly, as if the approaching sound of rescue had reached some unconscious part of her awareness, and Cole allowed himself the first real breath he'd taken since finding her. The Mustang stood in the swirling snow like a guardian angel made flesh, its injured leg forgotten in the moment of triumph, and Cole knew that whatever force had brought them together in this white wilderness had been working toward this exact moment of salvation. The helicopter's searchlight cuts through the storm like divine intervention, but this wounded Mustang's true purpose is only beginning to unfold. Subscribe to witness how broken guardians find their way home. The helicopter's searchlight carved through the blizzard like the finger of God himself, illuminating the scene in stark relief: the collapsed shelter, the rescued girl wrapped in emergency gear, and the dark silhouette of the Mustang standing guard over them all. Cole waved his signal flare in the practice pattern that would guide the rescue team to their exact location, but his eyes kept returning to the horse, this wounded animal that had somehow known exactly where to lead him through miles of trackless wilderness. The girl stirred again as the helicopter's rotor wash began to clear some of the falling snow, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness tried to return. And when she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the Mustang's face hovering protectively above her. Recognition dawned in her gaze like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, and she whispered a single word that the wind almost stole. Whisper. Dudden. The Mustang's ears pricked forward at the sound of its name, and Cole felt something shift in his understanding of the universe, a realignment that spoke of connections deeper than coincidence. The rescue team descended from the helicopter with the efficient precision of professionals who had done this dance too many times, but even they paused when they saw the Mustang standing vigil over the victim. Cole shouted over the rotor noise, explaining how the horse had led him to the girl, but the words felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had actually transpired in this white wilderness. The girl, her name was Sarah, she managed to whisper, reached out with a trembling hand to touch the Mustang's muzzle, and the animal lowered its head to accept the caress with the gentleness of something that understood the sacred nature of the moment. As the medics worked to stabilize her for transport, Sarah's eyes never left the horse, and Cole could see tears freezing on her cheeks as she tried to speak. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered to the Mustang, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's roar. "I knew you wouldn't forget me." The story emerged in fragments as the medics prepared Sarah for evacuation, pieces of a puzzle that Cole assembled with growing amazement and something that felt remarkably like divine revelation. Sarah had been on a trail ride with her youth group 3 days earlier, before the storm hit, and Whisper had been her assigned mount, a rescue Mustang that the local stable used for therapeutic riding programs. The horse had bonded with her immediately, she explained through chattering teeth, following her around the corral like a devoted dog and seeming to understand her in ways that transcended normal human-animal relationships. When the storm had separated her from the group, Sarah had taken shelter in the emergency hut, but the roof had collapsed during the night, trapping her in a space that was slowly filling with snow. She had been unconscious when the rescue team found her, hypothermic and barely clinging to life, but somehow Whisper had remembered her scent, had carried that memory through his own injury and exhaustion to lead Cole to this exact spot. Cole watched as the medics loaded Sarah onto the rescue basket, her hand still reaching toward the Mustang even as they secured her for transport. The horse stood perfectly still despite the helicopter's noise and wind, as if understanding that this moment required its presence more than its comfort. Sarah's lips moved as she tried to speak, and Cole leaned closer to hear her words over the mechanical thunder above them. "He saved me," she whispered, her eyes locked on Whisper's face. "Even hurt, even lost, he came back for me." The medic gave Cole a look that said they needed to go now, that every minute of delay increased the risk of complications. But Cole found himself reluctant to leave the Mustang alone in the storm. The horse had given everything to lead him here, had pushed through its own pain and exhaustion to save a girl who had shown it kindness, and the idea of abandoning it now felt like a betrayal of something sacred. The helicopter lifted off with Sarah safely aboard, its searchlight sweeping across the landscape one final time before disappearing into the storm, leaving Cole and Whisper alone in the sudden silence that followed. The Mustang stood motionless for a long moment, watching the aircraft's lights fade into the white distance, and Cole could see something that looked like satisfaction in the animal's posture, the stance of a creature that had completed its mission. But as the adrenaline of the rescue began to fade, Cole became acutely aware of their situation. They were miles from the nearest trail, in the middle of a blizzard that showed no signs of abating, with a horse that was clearly injured and exhausted from its heroic effort. The Mustang's breathing was labored now, steam rising from its coat in clouds that spoke of an animal that had pushed itself beyond its physical limits. And Cole realized that their story was far from over. The horse had saved Sarah, but now it needed saving itself, and Cole felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mantle he was meant to wear. As Cole approached the Mustang, the animal didn't shy away, but instead seemed to lean into his presence, as if finally allowing itself to acknowledge its own need for help. The horse's injured leg was clearly causing significant pain now that the adrenaline of the rescue had worn off, and Cole could see exhaustion in every line of its body. But there was something else in Whisper's eyes as well, a trust that hadn't been there before, a recognition that Cole had proven himself worthy of the faith the horse had placed in him. The wind continued to howl around them, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. But Cole felt a strange sense of peace settle over him as he stood beside this wounded animal in the white wilderness. They had saved Sarah together, this broken ranger and injured Mustang, and in doing so they had found something that neither of them had been looking for. A connection that transcended species and spoke to the deeper truths about healing and redemption that could only be discovered in the crucible of shared purpose. In the aftermath of Miracle, Cole faces a choice that will define both their futures. But first, he must confront the truth about why this wounded Mustang chose him. Subscribe to discover how broken souls recognize each other across the vast wilderness of the heart. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and hope, but Cole couldn't shake the scent of pine and blood that still clung to his jacket. 3 days had passed since they'd pulled Emma from that collapsed shelter. 3 days since Whisper had led him through the blizzard to save a life he didn't even know was lost. The girl was stable now, her frost-bitten fingers wrapped in gauze, her parents weeping gratitude in the waiting room, while Cole stood at the window, watching snow fall on the parking lot below. He'd given his statement to the sheriff, accepted the handshakes and the praise, but something hollow echoed in his chest every time someone called him a hero. Heroes didn't spend 15 years running from the faces of the men they couldn't save in Afghanistan, didn't wake up screaming names that would never answer back, didn't choose isolation over connection because the weight of other people's lives felt too heavy to bear again. The veterinarian had called that morning with news about Whisper. The Mustang's leg would heal, but slowly, and he'd need months of careful rehabilitation before he could return to the wild. Dr. Martinez had mentioned something about the horse's unusual behavior, how he kept looking toward the door as if waiting for someone, how he'd grown agitated whenever Cole's scent faded from the blanket they'd used to transport him. Cole had listened to the report with the phone pressed against his ear, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing a man who looked older than his 38 years, weathered by guilt and shaped by loss. The Mustang was waiting for him, the vet had said, and Cole understood that feeling, the terrible patience of creatures who'd learned that salvation sometimes came in the form of other broken things. That healing happened not in isolation, but in the space between wounded souls who recognized each other's scars. He drove to the Animal Rehabilitation Center as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in a week, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields that stretched toward the mountains. The facility sat nestled in a valley where rescued horses grazed in paddocks, their breath visible in the cold air, their coats thick with winter fur that spoke of survival and adaptation. Cole parked his truck and sat for a moment, watching a group of volunteers moving between the enclosures with buckets of feed and gentle voices, their movements careful and deliberate around animals who'd known trauma and learned to trust again. He thought about Emma's parents, how they'd looked at him with eyes full of tears and gratitude, how her mother had gripped his hands and whispered "thank you" over and over until the words became a prayer. But Cole knew the truth. He hadn't saved anyone. Whisper had done that, had chosen to follow a broken ranger through a blizzard because somehow the horse had understood what Cole was only beginning to grasp. Doctor. Martinez met him at the entrance, her weathered hands gentle as she led him through the facility toward the recovery stalls where Whisper waited. She spoke about the Mustang's progress, how his leg was healing faster than expected, how he'd been calm and cooperative with treatment, but restless whenever the wind picked up, as if he could smell the mountains calling him home. Cole listened with half his attention, the other half focused on the sound of horses moving in their stalls, the soft nickering and shuffling that spoke of creatures learning to trust human hands again after knowing only wildness and fear. They passed a mare with scars across her flanks, a gelding missing part of his ear, a young colt who pressed himself against the far wall whenever footsteps approached, all of them carrying the weight of whatever had brought them here. All of them learning that healing was possible, even for the most wounded among them. When they reached Whisper's stall, Cole felt his breath catch in his throat. The Mustang stood with his injured legs slightly raised, his dark coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his eyes alert and intelligent as they fixed on Cole's face with an intensity that made the ranger's chest tighten. The horse moved toward the stall door with a careful limp, his nostrils flaring as he caught Cole's scent, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition that went deeper than gratitude, deeper than the simple bond between man and animal. Cole reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing against the Mustang's muzzle, feeling the warm breath against his palm, as Whisper pressed closer to the bars. Doctor. Martinez spoke quietly about the horse's need for companionship during recovery, how Mustangs were social creatures who thrived on connection, how isolation could slow the healing process and leave psychological scars that never fully faded. The weight of that truth settled in Cole's chest like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through all the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. He understood what the veterinarian was really saying. Understood the choice that lay before him like a path through unmarked snow. He could walk away, let the professionals handle Whisper's recovery, return to his cabin and his solitude, and the familiar ache of living at arm's length from the world. Or he could stay, could learn to carry the weight of another creature's healing, could risk the terrible vulnerability of caring about something that might be taken away. Whisper's eyes held his gaze with patient intensity, and Cole saw in them the same recognition he'd felt during the blizzard. Two broken things finding each other in the wilderness, two souls who understood that sometimes salvation came not in the form of rescue, but in the choice to stop running from the very connections that might save them both. The Mustang's healing would require more than medical care. It would demand the kind of patient love that Cole had forgotten how to give. But as Whisper pressed his muzzle against Cole's palm, the ranger felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he'd kept locked for 15 years. Subscribe to witness how two wounded souls learn that healing happens not in isolation, but in the sacred space where broken hearts choose to trust again. Cole signed the papers that made him Whisper's temporary guardian, with hands that trembled slightly, the pen feeling heavier than any weapon he'd carried in Afghanistan, weighted with the responsibility of another life depending on his choices. Dr. Martinez had explained the rehabilitation process: daily exercises, careful monitoring, gradual reintroduction to movement and trust. But Cole heard beneath her words the deeper truth that healing was never just about the body. He'd arranged to visit twice daily, morning and evening, bringing with him the patience he'd learned in the mountains and the gentleness he'd forgotten he possessed. The drive from his cabin to the rehabilitation center became a ritual of preparation, each mile traveled in the pre-dawn darkness or fading twilight, a meditation on the weight of caring for something beyond himself, something that couldn't be fixed with solitude and silence. The first week passed in careful increments of progress, Whisper's leg growing stronger, his trust in Cole deepening with each visit, their communication developing into something that transcended words. Cole would arrive to find the Mustang waiting at the stall door, ears pricked forward with anticipation, dark eyes bright with intelligence, and something that looked remarkably like joy. They developed routines together. Cole would check the healing wound with gentle fingers while Whisper stood perfectly still, trusting human hands that had learned to touch without taking, to heal without demanding. The horse would nuzzle Cole's jacket pockets, searching for the apple slices and carrots the ranger had started bringing, and Cole found himself talking to Whisper in low, steady tones about the weather, the mountains, the small details of daily life that he'd never shared with another living soul. Dr. Martinez watched their interactions with the keen eye of someone who'd spent decades observing the bonds between broken creatures and the humans who chose to love them. She mentioned one evening that Whisper's recovery was progressing faster than any Mustang she'd treated, that the horse seemed to draw strength from Cole's presence in ways that defied medical explanation. Cole listened to her observations while brushing Whisper's coat, feeling the solid warmth of the horse's body beneath his hands, the steady rhythm of breathing that spoke of life persisting despite injury and trauma. The veterinarian spoke about the mysterious ways that healing happened, how sometimes the medicine that mattered most couldn't be measured in dosages or prescribed in bottles, how love itself became a kind of treatment that worked on wounds deeper than flesh and bone. The other volunteers at the center began to recognize Cole's truck in the parking lot, began to nod and smile when he passed them in the corridors, their faces reflecting the quiet approval of people who understood the sacred work of tending to broken things. He learned their names gradually. Sarah, who worked with the traumatized mares, Miguel, who specialized in horses rescued from neglect, Janet, whose gentle hands could calm even the most fearful animals. They shared stories during coffee breaks about the horses they'd saved and lost, about the mysterious bonds that formed between species, about the way healing happened not in isolation, but in community, in the patient presence of others, who understood that broken didn't mean worthless, that wounded didn't mean beyond redemption. Cole found himself staying longer with each visit, arriving earlier and leaving later, drawn by something he couldn't name but felt in his bones. The sense of belonging to something larger than his own pain, of being part of a story that included more than just his own survival. Whisper seemed to sense the change in him, the gradual softening of walls that had stood for 15 years, the slow thaw of a heart that had learned to protect itself by feeling nothing at all. The Mustang would rest his head against Cole's chest while the ranger worked, and Cole could feel the horse's heartbeat against his ribs, steady and strong and alive, a rhythm that seemed to sync with his own until he couldn't tell where his healing ended and Whisper's began. One evening, as snow began to fall outside the barn windows, Cole sat on a hay bale while Whisper dozed in his stall, the horse's injured leg finally bearing weight without pain, his breathing deep and peaceful in the way of creatures who'd learned to trust again. Cole thought about Emma, safe now with her family, about the blizzard that had brought them all together, about the mysterious ways that broken things found each other in the wilderness of the world. He understood now what Whisper had been trying to teach him during those desperate hours in the storm. That salvation rarely came in the form we expected, that sometimes the very wounds we carried became the means by which we recognized others who needed saving, that healing was not a destination, but a journey taken together, step by careful step, heartbeat by heartbeat, breath by breath. As Whisper's strength returned, Cole felt his own walls crumbling, 15 years of isolation giving way to something he'd forgotten how to name: hope. But the Mustang's recovery would soon force a choice that would test everything Cole had learned about love, loss, and the courage required to let go. Subscribe to discover how a wounded ranger learns that sometimes the greatest act of love is trusting another soul to find their way home. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow in rushing torrents that carved new paths down the mountainsides, and with it came the news that Cole had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Whisper was ready to return to the wild. Dr. Martinez delivered the verdict on a morning when the air smelled of pine sap and possibility, her words careful and gentle as she explained that the Mustang's leg had healed completely, that his spirit remained unbroken despite the trauma, that the time had come to release him back to the high country where he belonged. Cole listened with his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, his eyes fixed on Whisper's stall where the horse stood alert and strong, his coat gleaming with health, his dark eyes bright with the restless energy of a creature who could smell freedom on the wind. The ranger felt something tear in his chest, a wound opening that he'd thought had scarred over, the familiar ache of loving something that was never meant to stay. The rehabilitation center had protocols for release, careful selection of territory, gradual reintroduction to wild herds, monitoring to ensure successful integration. But Cole knew that no amount of planning could guarantee Whisper's safety once he returned to the mountains. The high country was harsh and unforgiving, full of predators and weather that could kill without warning. And Cole found himself lying awake at night, imagining all the ways he might lose the Mustang to the very wilderness that had shaped them both. He'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of their daily visits, to the solid comfort of Whisper's presence, to the way the horse's trust had slowly taught him to trust himself again. The thought of empty stalls and silent mornings felt like a return to the isolation he'd worked so hard to escape, like stepping back into a life measured only by his own heartbeat. Dr. Martinez suggested that Cole participate in the release process, that his presence might help ease Whisper's transition from captivity back to freedom, and Cole agreed with the heavy knowledge that he was volunteering to break his own heart. They chose a location in the high meadows where wild herds were known to graze, a place where Whisper would have the best chance of finding his own kind and remembering the ancient rhythms of Mustang life. Cole spent the week before the release visiting Whisper with increased frequency, memorizing the feel of the horse's muzzle against his palm, the sound of his breathing, the way his ears pricked forward whenever Cole's truck pulled into the parking lot. Each visit felt like a small goodbye, a gradual loosening of bonds that had become as essential to Cole's healing as they had been to Whisper's. The morning of the release dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains look close enough to touch and sharp enough to cut. Cole loaded Whisper into the trailer with hands that shook slightly, the Mustang stepping up the ramp with calm trust that made the ranger's throat tighten with unshed tears. They drove into the high country in convoy, Dr. Martinez in the lead vehicle, Cole following with Whisper, a small team of volunteers bringing up the rear with monitoring equipment and cameras to document the release. The road climbed steadily through forests of aspen and pine, past meadows where wildflowers were just beginning to push through the last patches of snow, toward the vast open spaces where Mustangs had run free for generations before humans ever set foot in these mountains. When they reached the release site, Cole felt his breath catch at the beauty of it. A rolling meadow surrounded by peaks that touched the sky, grass already green with spring growth, a stream running clear and cold through the center of it all. This was where Whisper belonged, in this cathedral of stone and sky and endless horizon, not in the confined safety of rehabilitation stalls or the limited affection of human companionship. Cole understood with painful clarity that love sometimes meant letting go, that healing sometimes required the courage to trust another soul to find their own way home. He opened the trailer door with steady hands, stepping back as Whisper emerged into the mountain air, the Mustang's nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of home, his body trembling with recognition and anticipation. For a moment, horse and man stood facing each other in the meadow, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them like morning mist. Cole reached out one last time to touch Whisper's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath his palm, the steady heartbeat that had become the rhythm of his own healing. The Mustang pressed his muzzle against Cole's chest, a gesture of gratitude and farewell that spoke louder than words. And then he was moving away, his gait strong and sure as he trotted toward the far end of the meadow, where the mountains called him home. Cole watched until Whisper disappeared over a ridge, his silhouette dark against the sky for one last moment before vanishing into the wilderness that had always been his true sanctuary, leaving Cole standing alone in the meadow with tears on his cheeks and something that felt remarkably like peace settling in his chest. As Whisper disappeared into the high country, Cole felt the familiar ache of loss, but this time it was tempered by something new. The knowledge that love didn't always mean holding on. Sometimes the greatest gift was the courage to let go, trusting that what you'd shared would live on in ways you couldn't see. Subscribe to witness how a wounded ranger discovers that healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about finding the strength to embrace an uncertain future. 6 months passed before Cole saw Whisper again. 6 months of returning to his ranger duties with a heart that felt both emptier and fuller than before, carrying the weight of love given and released, like a prayer whispered into mountain wind. The rehabilitation center had become part of his regular route, not as Whisper's guardian, but as a volunteer who understood the sacred work of tending to broken things, who'd learned that healing happened not in isolation, but in the patient presence of others, who knew what it meant to carry scars. He worked with new horses, a mare rescued from neglect, a gelding traumatized by abuse, a young colt who'd been separated from his mother too early, and in each of their eyes he saw reflections of his own journey from brokenness towards something that might be called wholeness. Dr. Martinez watched him work with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed a miracle, who'd seen a man learn to trust his own capacity for love again. The call came on a morning when autumn was painting the aspen groves gold and red, when the air carried the sharp promise of winter and the mountains stood clear against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. A hiker had reported a Mustang with distinctive markings in the high meadows, a horse that seemed unafraid of humans, that had approached their camp with curious intelligence rather than the wild wariness typical of his kind. Cole's heart began to race before Dr. Martinez finished describing the sighting, before she mentioned the old scar on the horse's left foreleg that could only belong to one Mustang, before she asked if he wanted to join the monitoring team that was heading up to check on the wild herds. He said yes without hesitation, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands, already reaching for his jacket and keys, while his mind filled with images of dark eyes and patient trust, of a bond that distance and time had not been able to break. The drive into the high country felt like a pilgrimage, each familiar turn in the road bringing Cole closer to something he'd thought was lost forever, something he'd learned to carry in memory rather than hope for in reality. The monitoring team consisted of Dr. Martinez, 2 graduate students studying wild horse behavior, and a photographer documenting the success of rehabilitation releases. But Cole barely heard their conversation as they climbed toward the meadows where Whisper had been spotted. His attention was focused entirely on the landscape rolling past the windows. The golden aspen groves, the granite peaks touched with early snow, the vast spaces where mustangs had run free for countless generations, where wounded creatures could find healing in the simple act of belonging to something larger than themselves. They set up their observation post on a ridge, overlooking the meadow where the herd had been reported, using binoculars and telephoto lenses to scan the grassland below for signs of movement. Cole's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his field glasses, sweeping across the terrain with the methodical patience he'd learned in the military, searching for the distinctive silhouette that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. The morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of horses, just the wind moving through the grass and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. And Cole began to wonder if they'd missed the herd entirely, if Whisper had moved on to other pastures, other mountains, other chapters of a life that no longer included human contact. Then, just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they appeared, a small band of mustangs emerging from a grove of pine trees at the far end of the meadow, their coats gleaming in the golden light, their movements fluid and graceful as they spread out to graze. Cole's breath caught in his throat as he spotted a familiar dark shape among them, a horse that moved with a slight favor of his left foreleg, whose intelligent eyes seemed to scan the horizon with the awareness of a creature who'd known both wildness and human kindness. Whisper had not only survived his return to the wild, he'd thrived, had found his place among his own kind, had become what he was always meant to be, a free creature living according to the ancient rhythms of his species. Through the binoculars, Cole watched Whisper interact with the other horses, nuzzling a mare, playing with a young colt, standing alert while the herd grazed, his body language speaking of confidence and belonging, of a soul that had found its home. The Mustang looked healthy and strong, his coat thick with winter growth, his movements sure and purposeful as he moved through the herd with the easy authority of a horse who'd earned his place through survival and strength. Cole felt tears blur his vision as he realized that this was what love looked like when it was allowed to flourish. Not possession or control, but the courage to let another soul become fully themselves, to trust that what you'd shared would live on in ways you couldn't see or measure. Whisper had carried the healing they'd found together back into the wild, had become living proof that broken things could be made whole, that love given freely would always find a way to multiply and return. As Cole watched Whisper move freely among his herd, he understood that their story had come full circle. Not to an ending, but to a beginning. The Mustang had taught him that healing wasn't about forgetting the wounds, but about transforming them into wisdom, into the capacity to recognize and save other broken souls. Subscribe to discover how a wounded ranger's journey with a Mustang becomes a testament to the power of love to heal not just individuals, but entire communities of broken hearts, learning to trust again. 5 years later, Cole stood at the edge of the same valley where Whisper had first found him, watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch behind him buzzed with quiet activity, the sound of healing happening in real time. Emma, now 21 and studying veterinary medicine, moved between the paddocks with the confidence of someone who had stared death in the face and chosen to live fully. Her laughter carried on the mountain air as she worked with a new arrival, a three-legged mare named Grace, who had been rescued from a highway accident. The girl who had once been broken in a collapsed shelter now spent her days mending the spirits of animals who, like her, had learned that survival was just the beginning of the story. Whisper grazed nearby, his limp barely noticeable now, his coat gleaming with the health that comes from being exactly where you belong. Cole touched the scar on his palm, the one from that first night when he'd tried to bandage Whisper's wounds, and marveled at how some marks become medals of honor rather than reminders of pain. The Broken Wings Ranch had become something neither Cole nor Emma had planned, but something the mountain itself seemed to have orchestrated. Word had spread through the veteran community about the place where wounded soldiers could work alongside wounded animals, where the language of survival was spoken fluently by both species. Marcus had been their first official resident, arriving 6 months after that blizzard night with his own ghosts and a service dog named Ranger, who had lost an eye in the same explosion that had taken Marcus's hearing. Now Marcus ran the ranch's woodworking shop, crafting custom saddles and therapeutic equipment, while Ranger supervised from his favorite spot in the sawdust. The workshop had become a sanctuary where the rhythm of hammer and chisel provided a meditation that no therapist had ever been able to offer. Cole watched through the window as Marcus fitted a special harness for a blind horse named Prophet, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had found his calling in the intersection of craftsmanship and compassion. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The deaf man who could hear the needs of silent animals, the blind horse who could navigate by trust alone. Dr. Sarah Chen had become more than the ranch's veterinarian. She had become its spiritual compass, the one who could read the invisible connections between broken hearts and wounded spirits. Her small hands had mended countless fractures, both physical and emotional, and her quiet wisdom had guided them through the delicate process of matching animals with humans who needed each other. She had been the one to suggest that Whisper's story be shared, not as entertainment, but as testimony to the power of divine orchestration in the wilderness of human suffering. The documentary crew had come and gone, but their film had opened doors to funding and partnerships that allowed the ranch to expand its mission. Sarah stood now in the medical barn, her stethoscope pressed against the chest of a young colt whose mother had rejected him, while a Vietnam veteran named Thomas held the foal steady with hands that had once trembled with nightmares, but now moved with the gentle authority of someone who understood abandonment. The rhythm of the colt's heartbeat seemed to synchronize with Thomas's breathing, creating a moment of perfect harmony that spoke to the deeper healing happening in this place. The children came on Saturdays, brought by parents who had heard about the ranch through whispered conversations in therapy waiting rooms and support group meetings. These were the kids who carried their own invisible wounds, the daughter of a soldier who had never come home, the son of a first responder who had seen too much, the children of families torn apart by the weight of service and sacrifice. Emma had developed a special program for them, pairing each child with an animal who had survived its own trauma. Today, a 7-year-old named Lily sat in the hay with a one-eyed goat named Courage, both of them sharing the kind of silence that only comes when two survivors recognize each other across the species divide. Cole watched as Lily's fingers traced the scar around Courage's missing eye, her own hand instinctively moving to the hearing aid that marked her as different in a world that often demanded perfection. The goat leaned into her touch with the wisdom of creatures who know that scars are not flaws, but evidence of battles survived and strength discovered. The blizzards still came each winter, but they no longer felt like enemies to Cole. Instead, they had become reminders of the night when everything changed, when a wounded Mustang had chosen to trust a broken ranger with a mission that neither of them fully understood at the time. During the storms, Cole would often find himself in the barn with Whisper, both of them listening to the wind howl around the sturdy walls that now sheltered dozens of animals and the humans who loved them. The Mustang would rest his head against Cole's shoulder, and in those moments, Cole could feel the weight of all the lives that had been saved because one horse had refused to give up on a man who had given up on himself. The ranch had become a beacon in the wilderness, a place where the lost could find their way home, not through GPS coordinates, but through the ancient navigation system of the heart. Emergency responders throughout the region now knew about the ranch, and more than once, Cole had received calls asking if he and Whisper could help search for missing hikers or lost children. The memorial wall in the main lodge bore the names of all the animals and humans who had found their final rest at the ranch, but it wasn't a place of mourning. It was a celebration of lives that had mattered, of connections that had transcended the boundaries between species and the limitations of mortal flesh. Emma had insisted on including a plaque for her father, the man whose death had sent her fleeing into the mountains where Whisper had found her. The inscription read simply, "He taught me that love is the only compass that never fails," and below it hung a photo of Emma and Whisper on the day she had graduated from veterinary school. Cole's own father's name was there too, along with the names of the soldiers he hadn't been able to save, their memory now honored not through guilt, but through the lives that continued to be rescued in their honor. The wall had become a pilgrimage site for families who had lost loved ones, a place where grief could transform into purpose and where the dead could continue to save lives through the living who carried their love forward. The partnership with the local Native American tribe had brought a deeper understanding of the spiritual dimensions of the work they were doing. Elder Joseph Crowfeather had become a regular visitor, sharing the ancient wisdom of his people about the sacred relationship between humans and animals, the way that wounded spirits could call to each other across vast distances and impossible circumstances. He had performed a blessing ceremony for Whisper, acknowledging the Mustang as a spirit guide who had been sent to fulfill a specific mission in the web of creation. The ceremony had taken place at sunset, with the entire ranch family gathered in a circle around Whisper, their voices joining in songs that had been sung for generations by people who understood that healing was not just a medical process, but a spiritual journey. Joseph had placed his weathered hands on Whisper's neck and spoken words in his native language that needed no translation. They were the sounds of gratitude, of recognition, of honor given to a creature who had chosen to serve something greater than himself. The university researchers had come seeking to study the therapeutic benefits of human-animal interaction, but they had left with something more valuable than data. They had witnessed the mystery of connection that defied scientific explanation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a trauma specialist from Denver, had spent 6 months at the ranch documenting the healing process, but her final report had included a section she called the unmeasurable factor, the inexplicable way that certain animals seem to choose specific humans, the intuitive matching that happened beyond any conscious decision-making process. She had been particularly fascinated by Whisper's ability to identify visitors who were struggling with suicidal thoughts, the way he would approach them with a gentleness that seemed to communicate understanding and hope. Her research had led to funding for similar programs across the country, but she always insisted that the original ranch remained unique, touched by something that couldn't be replicated through methodology or protocol. The letters arrived daily now, from around the world, from people who had heard Whisper's story and found in it a reason to keep fighting their own battles. Cole kept them in a special box in his office, reading them when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy, when he wondered if they were really making a difference in a world that seemed determined to break everything beautiful. A letter from a veteran in Australia who had started his own animal rescue after watching the documentary. A note from a teenage girl in Ohio who had decided not to end her life after reading about Emma's survival. A photograph from a family in Japan who had adopted a 3-legged dog and named him Whisper in honor of the Mustang, who had shown them that broken things could still be beautiful. Each letter was a thread in a tapestry of hope that stretched far beyond the boundaries of their mountain valley, proof that one horse's decision to follow a broken ranger through a blizzard had created ripples that would continue long after both of them were gone. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of purple and gold, Cole felt Whisper approach from behind, the familiar sound of hooves on packed snow announcing his presence before the gentle nudge against Cole's shoulder confirmed it. The Mustang's breath created small clouds in the cold air, and his dark eyes reflected the last light of day with the wisdom of a creature who had seen the worst of what life could offer and had chosen to believe in the possibility of redemption anyway. Cole wrapped his arms around Whisper's neck, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath the winter coat, the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of his new life. In the distance, the lights of the ranch buildings glowed warm against the gathering darkness, each window representing a life that had been touched by the miracle of connection, the power of wounded souls to heal each other through the simple act of refusing to give up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need of rescue, new humans searching for purpose. But tonight, in this moment, Cole knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, in the place where broken things become whole, where lost souls find their way home, and where the love between a man and a horse had become a beacon of hope for anyone brave enough to follow it through the storm.